Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center. She graduated from Rutgers University with a Bachelor of Arts in English Literature. Then she earned her JD from University of Virginia's School of Law. She has done research on a wide variety of topics, but her main areas of interest include the institutional analysis of property rights, land tenure, natural resource management, and international development. She has published her research in several academic journals, including Economic Affairs, the Electronic Journal of Sustainable Development, and the Denver Journal of International Law and Policy. In the past, Ms. Boudreaux has taught at George Mason University School of Law and Clemson University. She also worked for the Foundation for Economic Education as the Director of Programs, and she served on the working group on property rights of the UN's Commission on Legal Empowerment of the Poor. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Karol Boudreaux for her lecture on the case for cautious optimism, economic growth, and social change in Africa.
So we're going to figure out how we fix this.
Just grab the mouse.
Just press no.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you. Thank you, Savannah. Savannah is going to hear a bit of a repeat. She was in Arlington this past summer, and I gave another version of this lecture, so apologies to Savannah, but I hope for the rest of you, this will be interesting material. I'm hoping that it's material that will be new for some of you, and I'm hoping that it will tie into things that you're discussing in your classes. So what I'm going to be talking about is Africa, specifically sub-Saharan Africa. I have been working in sub-Saharan Africa since 2005. I'm not sure how many trips I've done at this point, but probably somewhere between 30 and 40 trips over the course of those years. And I love working in Africa. And the sort of highline first thing I want to say is that even during the time I've been going to Africa and doing work there, it's changed dramatically. And so we're going to be talking about what's behind some of those changes. The other top line message I want to share with you today is that if you take one line away from this talk, it should be institutions matter. And they matter a lot. And we're going to talk about why they matter and how they're changing and how that's leading to very different on-the-ground experiences for people who have struggled a lot over the past number of decades. So if I can figure out how to work things, oh, that was easy. Okay, so here's a picture. Anyone want to guess where this is from?
Sudan.
So close, not Sudan, but close to Sudan. This is from Central African Republic. Central African Republic is melting down as we speak. It has been melting down for some time. It's one of those countries in Africa that even people like me don't ever want to go to because it's kind of a basket case. There are things that work, one or two things that seem to have been working well a little bit in Central African Republic until recently, but over the last couple of months there's been a lot of ethnic violence, a lot of religious violence, a lot of violence in general. The government sort of disappeared. One government was driven out, another government took over. That government was finally pushed out not long ago, and there's a new acting president in the country. But when many of us think about Africa, when many Americans think about Africa, we probably think about an image that in some ways is like this. We think about a place that has a lot of violence. We think about a place that has a lot of problems related to poverty. So we might also imagine pictures of children who are malnourished. It's still the case that there are literally hundreds of millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa who are malnourished, although that's changing. Or we might think about pictures of people who just are having difficulties because they're in poor rural areas or they're in slums in cities and they're not able to benefit from economic growth and development the way that we all can benefit from economic growth and development. So I want to talk for a minute about I want to first recognize that this reality is still going on in some countries. There still is violence in places beyond Central African Republic. Eastern Congo would be another example. I want to talk about what has driven poverty for so long on the continent, and then I want to tell you the story of what's changing and why it's changing. So why so poor for so long? I was really pleased to have dinner with some of you before this talk, and learned that you had a seminar class in international development last semester, and where you would have talked about some of this. So how can we understand poverty? Peter Bauer, the great economist, once said, and I'm going to paraphrase, there's nothing really to understand about poverty. Poverty is the norm. What's really remarkable and what's interesting to try to study is wealth. How do we get societies that are wealthy? Well, we're all so used to living in wealthy societies, we're almost like fish swimming in water. And we don't always understand how critically important the institutions are that undergird our wealth and our prosperity. People who live in different environments are very well aware of the fact that institutions working in a poor manner lead to very bad outcomes for them. So let's quickly talk about what have been some of the real institutional challenge in Africa that's contributed to long-term poverty. The first one, almost everyone would agree with, is remarkably weak governance systems, remarkably limited rule of law. And so what does this mean? This means that rulers do things like get elected in year 1, and in year 30 they're still in the same place. And they're funneling resources that are meant to support the entire country. They're funneling resources to preferred folks, whether those are family relations, ethnic relations, or simply political allies of theirs. Governance systems aren't able to stop corruption. There aren't good court systems. There aren't prosecutors who are willing to bring cases against corrupt officials, because if they do, they end up in jail or something worse. So poor governance, the ability to run a country efficiently, effectively, transparently, in an accountable manner, those capabilities still are quite limited in many countries. So that's one piece of the puzzle. It's hard to get the government running well and efficiently. The other piece of the puzzle is it's really hard to do business on the ground in most African countries. A couple of reasons for that. It's hard to do business in the formal sector. There's a ton of business going on in the informal sector of the economy. The informal sector of the economy in a typical African country might be 70%. 70% of the economic activity is being conducted outside of the purview of the government. So this means businesses that are not registered, taxes that are not being collected, jobs that are very informal, and this is an audience that might not like a lot of regulation, but there's no regulation over any of the workplace environment. So much, there's not that there's not economic activity in Africa, there's a ton of it, but much of it, majority of it happens in this informal sector. And that's precisely because of the high regulatory barriers and trade barriers that exist in these countries. So it's costly to do business. It's very costly to register a business. It's very costly to close a business. There are lots and lots of regulations in the formal sector about how you can hire and fire workers, all of which makes it tough for new entrepreneurs to start new businesses and grow them when they're in competition with each other and have to deal with this. On top of that, it's very costly to trade across borders. The highest tariff barriers in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa. Trading between Tanzania and Kenya has become more reasonable over the last several years, but it would not be uncommon to find trade barriers that were at the 30%, 40% level to trade goods across borders between African countries. So that just makes it more costly to do business. Some other problems that have certainly contributed to slow economic growth are tensions, ethnic tensions. Africa's like the countries are in important ways sort of made up things. The Europeans carved the continent up in the late 19th century. They put borders where they wanted to put borders. Sometimes they divided ethnic groups. One group's living on one side of the border in one country, the rest of the group is living on the other side of the border. People who don't want to be near each other have been moved or displaced or resettled in some countries, and that's certainly driven violence, which contributes to lower economic growth. And then a lot of really bad policy choices, especially after countries won their independence, and that happened primarily in the late 1950s through the 1960s. And by poor policy choices, I mean things like this. Countries openly embracing socialism. Ghana, Tanzania were two countries that were specifically, where the leadership specifically undertook socialist experimentations, moving everybody in Tanzania into villages through a villagization process, taking people away from their homes, pulling them all together, deciding that the government would run all the economic activity in the country, and we know what happens when those kinds of experiments take place. Nothing very good. So also contributing to poor economic growth and poverty over the long term, but also policies that Western economists suggested for some African countries as they were coming out of colonialism that were adopted. Policies like import substitution. Countries determined that it would be appropriate for them to put off the shackles of the colonial oppressive governments, and rather than purchasing manufactured goods from the ex-colonial rulers, make things themselves. And what we know about economics, if you've all taken it, which I presume most of the folks in this room have, is that countries have different advantages at producing different things. No one country can produce everything very effectively itself, and yet African countries in the 1950s and 1960s were buying into policies promoted by some Western economists that were saying to them, oh, don't import things from other parts of the world. Make it yourself. You'll grow manufacturing businesses. You'll end up creating jobs, and in the long term, you'll be better off. In the long term, they were not better off. All of that stuff then contributed to countries being quite poor for a long time. But that's kind of the old news. And that's what's amazing about Africa. All this stuff is changing. And understanding why it's changing is important, and we're going to talk about that now. So here's the new normal in sub-Saharan Africa. When I'm talking, I'm not going to be talking about North Africa. I myself, I don't work there, so the focus is all below the Sahara and below. So for the decade 2001 to 2010, 6 out of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world were in Africa. 6 out of 10 of the fastest growing economies were in Africa. And in part, these economies were growing because there had been natural resource discoveries. Oil, natural gas, some mineral wealth had been discovered. But at the same time that these countries were growing economically by having these tremendous resources discovered and now at under the government's control or under control of entrepreneurs, productivity was growing as well. So people were becoming more productive as workers on the continent. So that today, according to the latest estimates, more than 13% of the folks living in Africa are middle class by African standards. African middle class is defined differently from US middle class, but still, if you were to compare this number of folks to the number of middle class people in India, there are more middle class citizens in sub-Saharan Africa today than there are in the country of India, which has a larger population, but they're close population-wise. So things are changing so much that rather than now talking about Africa kind of as a basket case, as a place that is in need of our help, as a place that is really sort of on life support, on his most recent trip to sub-Saharan Africa, President Obama said that he was interested in talking with African leaders about a partnership of equals. Now that may be a bit of hyperbole, right? It would be hard to identify many countries in the world that would engage in a partnership of equals with the United States, but increasingly, the recognition is that African countries are producing valuable goods, they are growing economies in important ways, and so rather than being seen as the recipients of aid, they are actually they can be partners with us in trade. So more of a trade, not aid approach is what's happening. And that's what this shift in the narrative is about. Increasingly, people are talking who work in the international development community. They're talking about Africa rising. They're talking about how Africa can trade. They're trying to understand what Africa's comparative advantage is, or the different countries within Africa, what their comparative advantages are. So a little bit more about how things are changing, just to kind of drive this point home. The first line I think is really critically important. For the first time since the early 1980s, less than half of the population in sub-Saharan Africa is living in something other than abject poverty. Abject poverty means you're living on $1.25 a day or less. So until recently, more than half the people in the continent were living on $1.25 a day or less. And that number is radically decreasing year by year, millions of people, as a result of economic growth, as a result of increased entrepreneurial opportunities, are being lifted out of poverty and living different lives. And because there's more economic activity, because there's more wealth on the continent, that's translating directly into health benefits, most importantly for women and children, fewer women dying in childbirth, more children living past the age of 5. Hard to quantify the benefits of that, but over the long term, it will mean more productive people on the continent. Household consumption is rising, people are able to buy more consumer products, things that we might think, it's not a big deal. But for some of these families, being able to buy a television is in fact a really big deal. Being able to buy a car is a major deal. The first time I went to Nairobi, the first time I visited Nairobi was in 2006. It wasn't common to see a lot of cars on the streets. The last time I was in Nairobi a year ago, I was shocked at the amount of traffic on the streets and how many relatively new cars were driving in the traffic jams that were making it very difficult to get across town. That kind of visible change is really noticeable because it took place in such a short period of time. And it's a reflection of that growing middle class. Oops, sorry, I wanted to go back, but I'm not sure how I go back. Okay, well, we'll just go on. So what else is happening that's really interesting in the area? Let me just continue and talk about the growth rates. Does anyone know what U.S. economic growth rate was for 2013?
Like 3%.
Yeah, I don't actually know. It was probably between 1.5% and 3%. Probably not, 3% is probably a little high. So we've been growing at relatively low rates for a really long time in the United States. China has been growing at very high growth rates, 9–10% per year for a couple of decades, as a result of which 300–400 million people have risen out of poverty in China. In Africa, the growth rates for a decade now have not been as strong as Chinese growth rates, but they've been much stronger than our growth rates. So starting from a really low bar, some pretty strong growth rates now for going on 15 years, on average over 5% a year. At the same time, inflation has come down all across the continent. And when inflation comes down, it's like you're getting extra money in your pocket as a consumer. That means you have more money to spend because the current currency is more valuable. The government's not stealing some of your money from you by inflating the currency. So that means people can consume more. That's contributing to that rise in consumption rates that we were seeing. Here's a really important issue, that third bullet. During the mid to late 1990s, organizations that are oftentimes vilified, like the International Monetary Fund, went into African countries and said something like the following. Tess is going to now be, which country would you like to be?
Oh, I don't know. Pick your favorite.
I'm going to pick my favorite. My favorite country, probably actually didn't have to go through this because they're so I'm going to pick like a basket case country. Let's say you were Ghana. So Tess is going to be Ghana. The IMF went into countries like Ghana and said, hey, you people have been doing like a really bad job for a long time now. And we keep giving you money and things aren't changing. So here's what we're going to say. If you want more money, you're going to have to shape up, young lady. We're going to ask you to do things like shrink the size of the public sector. We're going to ask you to do things like get that inflation thing under control, will you? Because, right, this is just ridiculous. So the IMF actually went into countries, and if you do that, then I'll give you your money. But otherwise, you're not getting your allowance. It's not going to happen. So the IMF actually did condition a lot of its lending in the late 1990s in ways that led to important macroeconomic changes. It led to countries, again, bringing that inflation under control, and it led to many privatization efforts. So many of the economies of sub-Saharan Africa had nationalized industries, parastatals. The government ran the telephone, were in the telephone system. How many people do you think had telephones? Like nobody. There were no landlines, and anyone who had landlines anyone who had a phone had to wait 3 years to get one and pay a fortune to get it. And we will talk about the telecommunications revolution that is responsible in part for transforming Africa. So state businesses were sold off, privatized. That process is almost never a smooth process and oftentimes leads to some people benefiting more than others, but it did begin to introduce competition into these economies that were simply not competitive. At the same time, regulatory barriers started falling, and because people were here's the hypothesis, people are living a little bit better, they're starting to have a little bit more that they want to protect, it turns out there's actually less conflict going on as well. So back in the 1980s, there were dozens of live conflicts going on across the continent. Today, there are a handful, a small number of conflicts. The costs that are associated with conflicts are costs that there's an opportunity cost to conflict, right? All the resources that you're using to fight people could be used to do other stuff. Conflict is costly. A lot of African resources now are freed up because there's less conflict and can be put to more productive use. So changes to institutions, to ask governments to be more responsible fiscally, changes to the economy, opening up the economy, have had a really important impact across the continent. And so some people will say when I give this talk, oh, it's all being driven by the oil. This is all a story, these growth rates, these changes in GDP, it's all about oil. It is not all about oil. Oil's important, natural gas is important, but there's a lot more going on than just oil discoveries. For example, as I mentioned a moment ago, the telecom sector in Africa has absolutely exploded. There are more cell phones in sub-Saharan Africa today I think there's more than one cell phone per person in sub-Saharan Africa today. It's an extraordinarily competitive sector because governments deregulated telecom. And so the landlines were doing nothing. No one was getting access to cell phones and landlines 15 years ago. Now that cell technology has come to Africa, now that cell phone companies have stepped in and have offered competitive products to consumers on the ground, Africans in the middle of the rural areas are able to talk with relatives in the cities. They're able to do things with cell phones that we cannot do here in the United States, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. And that has led to a lot of job creation, a lot of technological innovation that's benefited many people. At the same time, banking was also deregulated. Part of that liberalization policy that was going on in the 1990s. So banks became more competitive as well. That's also leading to more lending for entrepreneurs on the ground, allowing more people to build businesses, creating more jobs. Agriculture, too, is rapidly shifting away from just producing things like primary commodities, basic coffee, to producing more value-added products. So roasted coffee beans rather than exporting green coffee beans. Fruit juices from South Africa rather than just shipping out the fruits themselves. In a variety of ways, Africans are looking for opportunities to add value to agricultural production in Africa rather than having that value added outside of the continent. Because the more value that's added locally, the more that the folks who are adding them, the more of the economic benefits of that product are kept locally. Okay, and increasingly more manufacturing too. There's a lot of less expensive labor, inexpensive labor in Africa. Not a lot of it has great education, but people do have skills, and so you're seeing things like the development of a very robust and competitive auto parts sector from South Africa, competing with folks in this part of the world, in Michigan and Detroit. So lots of things changing, lots of things going on, a lot of it very positive. There is some formal sector job growth, so people leaving that informal sector and moving into jobs that are in the kind of industries or with the kind of companies we all would recognize. And that's great. Here are some other important trends. We'll talk about this just very briefly. Lots of people are moving into cities. Cities are so important. They drive economic growth in important ways. They drive technological advances. People come together and exchange ideas with people they would never meet and never see in rural areas. They get ideas. They're entrepreneurially alert, and they figure out how they can serve other people. So lots of service sector activity goes on in cities. It just drives it's a really powerful process that's going on. Africa this year is 50% urbanized. It's maybe something you didn't realize. But what's also happening is, as a result of these changes, more products being produced on the ground in these countries, trade barriers shifting, more African products are available for purchase all around the world. So they're definitely part of the global economic stream. And they're able to be part of that stream within Africa as well as regional trade barriers come down. Here's one of the things that's really important. Foreign direct investment, which was virtually non-existent 15, 20 years ago, because who put money in Africa? Would you, like, if you had $1 million, would you, see, you're all too young, you're not going to remember. But if you had $1 million, would you be investing it in Africa? No, like, that sounds like crazy talk. Why would you do that? But look what's happening. Between 2000 and 2008, quantum leap in terms of foreign direct investment on the continent, and that number is larger today than it was in 2008. 2008, right, is when we have the financial crisis, and so the investment dips a little bit, but it's coming right back up now. And that money is going there because the returns on investment are the highest in the world. Investing in sub-Saharan Africa can get you as an investor better returns than anywhere else in the world. It's risky, but you can get some good returns. And why foreign direct investment is important because it brings stuff with it. An American company goes to Africa, creates, partners with, develops a business on the ground, brings its own know-how, its own technology, its own way of doing business, its understanding of global markets to the folks on the ground there, who then can absorb those skills, build human capital, change the way they think about doing business. So it's a very important way that capital, human capital as well as financial capital, can be built on the ground. So this is just a graph that shows you from the World Bank what's happened in terms of FDI inflows into sub-Saharan Africa, and you can see a strong peak in 2008, then some fall off, but then in 2011 the investment was beyond what it had been in 2008. So a lot of people, this means, are making a bet. They're saying, yep, you know what? This place is different. We think there's enough stability, we think there's enough opportunity here that we can recoup our investments. We're not just plunging money down a toilet. We're going to get something good back by being here. And that's really pretty remarkable. Okay, so who is investing in Africa? Well, it's a lot of Africans. A lot of people from the continent are taking money that they're earning or they've put away and putting it either in their domestic market or in other markets in Africa. So the South Africans, the Nigerians, very active in investing in other parts of the continent, but also among the top 20 investors, private sector investors, you'll see a number of American companies, and then some very notable foreign companies like Nestle and Toyota. So the major corporations in sub-Saharan Africa today are not just the oil companies. They're increasingly service providers or food and beverage companies like Coke and Nestle. Sometimes people think, oh, it's China that's driving all the growth. The Chinese are taking over Africa. And it's certainly the case that there are a lot of Chinese on the ground in Africa. It's certainly the case that the Chinese government has invested quite a lot on the ground in Africa. You can see in the chart over to my left the degree to which the Chinese are either importing or exporting to Africa. You can see they're exporting a lot. But then over here you can see how much they're investing on the ground in Africa. And so here is the figure. You may not be able to read it. It's a little fuzzy. $13.8 billion invested between 2005 and 2010 or 13.8% of the total investment going to sub-Saharan Africa. But look, does that mean China is sort of wholly laser-eyed focused on investing only in Africa, which is sometimes the impression that you get? And the answer from looking at this chart from The Economist is no, actually not. They're actually investing more money in the Americas than they are in Africa. Because there are good opportunities in the Americas, and the Chinese are going where there are good opportunities. So there is a lot of Chinese presence on the ground, building a lot of infrastructure, getting access to a lot of the mineral wealth and the resources. But it's not that the Chinese are either the leading investor in Africa or investing there more than they're investing in other places. The lead investors in sub-Saharan Africa are Europeans, then the Americans, then after that the Chinese. Okay, so who else is investing? Well, the diaspora is investing. There's a large Arab diaspora in Detroit, if I'm remembering correctly. There is a very large African diaspora in Washington, D.C., where I'm from. Lots and lots of Ethiopians, lots of Eritreans, some Nigerians, and the folks who are here and have been here for a decade, 2 decades, are sending remittances, payments of money back to folks, their family, at home, in their home countries. And what are people doing with those remittances? They're paying for their kids to go to school, they're paying medical bills, and they are helping to build small businesses that in some cases grow into bigger businesses. I want to underscore the fact that remittances are by far the largest flow of foreign aid that exists in our world. Remittance flows swamp official development assistance. They are 3 times as large as official development assistance figures. Official development assistance is the formal name for foreign aid. Personal aid is multitudes bigger than official foreign aid. And it's direct foreign aid. It's money from me to my family member. I probably know what my family member needs. I probably know what they're going to do with the money. I can monitor what they're going to do with the money. It's very effective, and there is a lot of involvement by the diaspora, not only through remittances, but increasingly by people going back to their home country. Young Africans who've been educated in the United States and Europe saying, hey, I don't need to stay in Washington. I can turn around and go back to Lagos. I can go back to Nairobi. There's a booming software hub in Nairobi. I can go work there. That's where my family is. Why would I stay in London? It's cold, it's rainy, the food's, okay, but it's not home. So more and more people are going home to do work, bringing skills with them, bringing knowledge, bringing their enthusiasm, their entrepreneurial visions. I've talked about the growing middle class already. Just a little bit more background or color for what does that mean to say there's a growing middle class. 60 million households earning $5,000 a year or more. $5,000 can buy you quite a lot in some of these countries. That's a good thing. Urbanization, a lot of people who are in the middle class are in these urban areas finding jobs. It's not like there's a growing middle class out in rural Malawi. That's not where this is happening. It's happening in the cities. And that is leading to, this is for those of you who took the International Development course, this growing middle class, many scholars are starting to argue, is actually leading to some improvements in terms of rule of law on the ground. This is one of the great things about a middle class, the bourgeois. I'm part of the bourgeois. I'm part of the middle class. What do I want as a middle class American? I can tell you what I want. And then, actually, you guys tell me what you want. And put yourself in the shoes of a middle class person. What do you want? Some of you are that, but some of you are probably maybe better off than that. So imagine yourself being a newly arrived middle class. Oh, that's even better. Newly arrived middle class person. You got your house. You got your kids. What is it you want?
Hot tub.
Maybe. Think a little bigger. You want that hot tub, and what else do you want what do you want to happen? Yes.
Good schools.
You want good schools. You want your kids educated. Do you want someone to be able to take your hot tub? Heck no. You want some secure property rights. You want your home that you're going to work hard to make better. You want it to be safe. You want to ensure that that property is going to be yours so you can use it to give it to your kids if you want, or do something else with it. What else do you want? You want people walking around with, yes?
Oh, medical care.
You want medical care. You want service delivery. You want some decent amount of public good provisions. It's not a public good, but you want some decent amount of services provided by, and it's all basically all provided by the government. You want health care, so you want education, you want health care, you want your home to be secure, not arbitrarily taken. There's one other really critical thing you want. You want to be able to walk down the streets and not worry that someone's going to pull a gun out or a knife or a machete and attack you or your wife or your kids in the street. So you want a safe, relatively safe environment. All that stuff means that you need to have a more accountable, more transparent, more responsible public sector. So those demands from the middle class may be helping to actually address some of the rule of law problems on the ground on the continent. Okay, and these middle class people, they're not, some of them are, but not all of them are in the informal sector. They're not entrepreneurs because they need to be, they're entrepreneurs because they want to be. So we've talked about what's made a difference. What's made a difference, and this has been really important, are those changes that were associated with making sure that the government was being more fiscally responsible. Here's another thing that I think actually made a really big difference. The World Bank started a project a number of years ago, it's more than 10 years ago now, called the Doing Business Report. The Doing Business Report tracks how many days and how much money it costs for you as an average business person to do some things. How many days does it take Tessa to file the paperwork that she needs to open a formal sector business? In some countries, it might take 570 days. And it might take the equivalent of 2 years of income for her to actually go through that. So the World Bank went through this process of ranking every single country in the world in the formal sector around things like how long does it take to start a business, how long does it take to close a business, how much time and effort does it take to hire and fire people, what if you want to buy a piece of commercial property, how long is that going to take, how much is it going to cost? And it ranked countries from best to worst. And you know what? People don't like to be worst. Countries don't like to be worst either. So that ranking, having a spotlight on, what country are you, or Ghana? Having a spotlight on Ghana and saying, Ghana, man, you're really bad. You're like number 140 on the list. Wow, shoot, yikes. The Ghanaian finance ministers, over time, along with other officials in the Ghanaian government, said, you know what, we don't really want to be 140. We'd really like to be 120, and maybe we could make changes that would get us up to 100. And the grand thing about this World Bank project was that it actually showed government officials where the bottlenecks were. It actually showed them, you know what, it's taking 50 days at this ministry to get this piece of paper. And so because there was something the governments could focus on to change and improve, they actually started doing it. They actually started making changes in the regulatory environment, first getting the low-hanging fruit that made it easier and less costly to do business on the ground. And that's had an important effect. So these things all taken together have created more space. A window opened, a window of opportunity in a lot of countries has opened for entrepreneurs to do what entrepreneurs do everywhere in the world, which is figure out ways to meet consumer demand. Do more, do better, do it with less. And so what I'm going to do now in the remaining time that I have, which is about 10 minutes, I'm going to very quickly walk through a couple of examples of interesting entrepreneurial ventures that are going on the ground that are specifically focused at solving some of the problems governments can't solve or don't solve. And I'm going to start with a kind of an icky one, but I just love this example. I love this example of Ecotact. Ecotact is a private sector company based in Nairobi in Kenya that provides clean toilets for people who live in informal settlements, otherwise known as slums. So slums are in urban Africa prevalent. in a slum, it would be very unusual for there to be, people do not have bathrooms in their shacks in the slums. They either have to go to the bathroom outside, or they have to use a shared toilet facility. And there might be 10 for 100,000 people in a typical slum. So you can imagine what state the facilities would be in, and you can imagine how difficult it would be for people and how bad it is for health reasons, for other reasons, for people to actually be using the bathroom outside. And to get water, there's not running water in shacks. You have to go to a spigot, and you have to turn the spigot on and get water to carry it back in a jerry can to your shack where your family's living. So the entrepreneur behind Ecotac is a man named David Curia. He was addressing the following problem through his entrepreneurial venture. Millions of people die every year because this situation exists. Because of poor sanitation, because of unclean water, they get sick, they get diarrhea. Little kids, they die as a result of this. And he realized this was harming his family directly. He didn't like his mother and his sisters having to go out late at night to use the bathroom in unsafe conditions. So he said, and the government of Nairobi, the municipal government, isn't solving the problem. There are slums all over the city, and the city government is not providing sewers, toilet facilities, adequate running water. So he says, I know, what if I started a business? What if I built this? And what if there were clean toilets inside here? What if I hired people to keep everything clean in there? And what if I provided clean water so people could go here and fill up their cans? And what if I charged them a little bit of money to do it? Would people come? If I built it, will they come? And you know what? They came. People decided they would much rather spend a couple of cents to use a safe, clean toilet at one of these facilities than go to the free services provided by the city of Nairobi. So that today, he does this on a franchise basis, so every one of these Ecotac facilities is owned by a different person, staffed with people who are cleaning, who are taking the fees to come in. Every one of these also usually has other services with them. It could be a shoe shine guy, could be a little convenience store almost attached to it, or a seamstress or a tailor. More than 100 of them now across the country. So he came up with a model to solve a very basic problem, getting clean water, better sanitation facilities to people in urban areas. And he's turned it into a business. I think that's really fascinating. They're spreading now into Tanzania as well. Here's the next one, Living Goods, very interesting company. The problem it's trying to solve is, it's really hard to get health care in rural Africa. It's hard to move around in rural Africa. The roads are bad. It can take hours to get to a clinic. So what if this company did the following? What if it trained a bunch of people to be the Avon ladies of Africa? Avon's the model. These women get trained, and they're going to go out and walk out to villages, and they're going to sell lipstick, and they're going to sell toilet paper, and they're going to sell soap to wash dishes, and they're also going to be trained to know how to deal with the top 5 diseases that harm children and families in rural Africa. And they're going to be able to sell medicines at a reduced cost to treat those problems. Dehydration would be an example. Malaria would be an example. So there's a commercial part of the business. We're going to go out and sell stuff that we think people want by having these women go out to villages, walking out there. But as they're going out and selling, they will see, by working with their customers, they will see who has a sick baby. Or the customers actually will now use the cell phones. Now that everyone has cell phones, maybe I'm a customer, and I can call and say, hey, the next time you come to the village, can you come like tomorrow? Can you come in the next day or two? My baby's sick. She's got diarrhea. She's going to need rehydration salts. Can you please bring some? I'll buy them from you. And that's a better alternative for me than having to get into a minibus and maybe taking a 2-day trip to the closest medical clinic where I'd have to wait hours anyway to be seen. So it's a very interesting way of meshing consumer demand with health care and medical service provision and spreading across Africa. Here's another one. Here's a problem. How do you educate people? How do you educate the poor? Well, increasingly, just wait. The amazingness of cell phones. Bridges International Academy actually is providing a full package classroom for poor consumers. So Bridges does sort of like a cradle to grave thing. They help folks in Kenya find land, build a building, create a curriculum, train teachers, get students into the classroom, test the students so that parents can be assured that kids are actually learning something. This is a real problem in many countries. Public schools are provided. Primary education is almost universally free, but the quality is not good. So you have teachers who aren't really trained, you've got 80 kids in classrooms, you don't have books in classrooms, and parents know their kids need better. They need more education so that they can compete in marketplaces moving forward. So Bridges has actually adopted a for-profit model to provide poor families with access to better quality education. And again, it's a model that's expanding through Kenya. You could walk into any informal settlement, basically, virtually any informal settlement in sub-Saharan Africa and in India and in Latin America, and you would already find private education entrepreneurs. But Bridges is almost doing that at scale, providing a consistent product like McDonald's, but providing a consistent education product to the poor who want their children to learn. Delight, maybe this is the next to last example. Delight is a great company, also a for-profit company that's doing what? They are making solar lanterns and they're selling them. And they're shipping tens of thousands out a month. So in places in Africa that are off the electricity grid, where when night comes, what happens? People build fires in their homes or outside of their homes, and that's the light you have. This company is saying, nope, we can do something different. We can sell solar lanterns, you can hang it up inside your home, and your kids, because they have reliable light now, your kids can finish their homework at night, they can read longer, they can study. If you have a little business, you can do your books at night. If you're a seamstress, you can sew at night, and you don't have to be ruining your eyes relying on the light that comes from a fire, and you don't have to have so much particulate matter inside your house. Because the fires that are burning are charcoal fires or dung fires or they're kerosene fires, and they're burning inside of houses, and there's a huge problem with the health costs of indoor pollution. So Delight, serving now 23 million people around the world, allowing people to have more time in their day to do more things. Again, a for-profit model. Finally, then M-Pesa. How many of you have heard of M-Pesa? Okay, this is like a miracle, but it's not. It's entrepreneurship. This is the miracle of entrepreneurship. M-Pesa is a cell phone-based service that allows you to move money. It allows you to buy cards that contain the equivalent of currency, and allows you, by sending SMS messages, to transfer money from one cell phone to another cell phone, from one account to another account. It's mobile money. It started in Africa. It started actually as a pilot project by the British International Development Agency, DFID. And people realized pretty quickly, wow, this is going to be absolutely amazing, because most people in Africa do not have bank accounts. And so in order to pay for things, you'd actually have to walk around with cash in your pockets. Or maybe only deal with the people you trusted, and so limit the number of people with whom you could deal, because you wouldn't want to deal with a stranger and take an IOU from a stranger. You'd want them to pay you right away, or you wouldn't do business with them. M-Pesa allows you to sort of leapfrog over commercial banking, have a way to get money to people you don't necessarily know, don't necessarily trust, easily at low cost. It's mushroomed. Today, something that didn't exist in 2007, allowing people to pay their bills this way, today literally has millions of people using it in East Africa. I wanted to, if I had had more time, I would have showed you a little, there's a really funny little video that M-Pesa has produced now, and it shows you these middle-class Kenyans who are sort of paying their bills and doing this and that with their cell phones. And it's so different from what many Americans think of as the African experience that it's fun to show just for the sort of culture shock of it. Okay, so we're almost done though, but it's not that story the story I've been telling of great growth, entrepreneurial excitement and change on the ground. That story is happening, but there still are red flags. And the red flags are important. And just a couple of them include, there still does need to be a lot more attention and a lot more improvement around the governance issue, especially around corruption. But the good news here is that technology is really helping on that. Efforts like, some of you may be familiar with a website called I Paid a Bribe, allows people to anonymously identify where they've been asked for a bribe at which government office. That kind of web-based technology is allowing more and more people to really spotlight corruption and governance problems in countries. There still do need to be reductions to trade barriers. They're still relatively high, but getting better. Probably education is one of the critical issues here. Even though bridges exist, there need to be thousands of bridges across Africa. In some countries, South Africa is maybe the leading example today. The quality of education today in 2014 is less good than it was during probably right at the end of the apartheid era. The quality of education has been consistently declining, test scores consistently declining in South Africa. So there's a real need to improve education. And there are some other trigger points on the continent. Land relations are one of the key trigger points. People do not have secure rights to property in almost every place. And that's the sort of thing that people kill each other over. When you try to take my property from me, if my property is what I rely on to feed my family, if I have no other social security net that I can rely on, if I get displaced, I'm going to fight you about it. And we're seeing rising levels of conflict around land issues. But despite that, despite the red flags, the general point is, literally for millions of people in Africa, life is better today than it was 5 years ago. 5 years from now, it's going to be even better. There are going to be even more people in that growing middle class. And overall, although there are still problems, the institutions are getting better, and that matters. That institutional improvement is crucially important. Trade's expanding, the middle class is growing. If you care about this stuff, civil and political rights are generally being respected, not everywhere perfectly, but generally respected and growing. So are there concerns in Africa today? Absolutely. The first picture I showed you of violence in the Central African Republic is real, and it's a real reason for concern. But overall, what you should take away from the lecture, I hope, is a message that's really very positive. The message is that for more and more people, they're living prosperous lives that are defined by them choosing how they can flourish and not being constrained by the awful bonds that poverty has kept them in for so long. So with that, I have time for questions, and maybe a little less than I had hoped, but I would be really happy to take your questions. Thank you so much.
So given what you just said, it seemed to me like most of the improvements, or most of the things that are kind of making these positive changes have come from like entrepreneurial spirit and people kind of getting in, seeing these particular problems and solving them, and coming up with these different ideas and how to solve them. And so I guess my question is, where does foreign aid from the government like play into aiding in that? If it seems like most of the positive things I'm noticing aren't tied to that. Like I don't like, is there a place for foreign aid to help?
So I do think there's a place for foreign aid. I would have maybe a somewhat more constricted view of where aid can be useful than a lot of people in the development sector. So where can foreign aid be useful? Part of foreign aid is humanitarian assistance, right? It's what happens when there's an earthquake. What happens when there's a famine? Can we get money to people who are desperately in need because they're either going to face real problems like starvation or they're gonna face serious medical concerns, their houses have been ruined. So there probably is, I think, a role for foreign assistance to play in helping to get a robust response to a humanitarian crisis. Having said that, we all know that responses to humanitarian crises do not always work well, and Haiti is the primary example of this, right? But in some cases, they do work well. Getting, like Bill Easterly says, getting medicines into the hands of people at low cost, that's probably something that development agencies do reasonably well. Should development agencies be focused on recreating economies in other parts of the world? Probably not. Look, the development agencies don't know, suffer from the knowledge problem just like everyone else suffers from the knowledge problem. So there are some things that can be done. It's probably a lot less than what currently is being done.
To kind of branch off that question, do you think, in terms of foreign aid, do you think food aid is more beneficial or harmful to sub-Saharan Africa as a whole?
So my personal opinion is that food aid is more harmful than it is helpful. And it's been encouraging to see shifts, I think, in the way governments are approaching, developed world countries are approaching food aid. Food aid means that American surplus agricultural products are put on American flag carrier ships and sent to places that are facing famine. And it takes months to move those products, and it dumps products into markets, and then, not surprisingly, harms local producers and creates real disincentives for local farmers to stay in that business if they're going to be competing with free products all the time, right? So when we dump free food into these countries, we may think we're solving a short-term problem, but we're creating long-term problems at the same time. So increasingly, countries that want to do food aid are actually using cash and going and trying to buy food from local producers and get it shipped to wherever the need is greatest. So if there's food to be purchased in Tanzania and there's a famine in Ethiopia, purchase it in Tanzania, ship it to Ethiopia. Yes, sir.
What do you think about developing countries hosting large world events like the World Cup or the Olympics? Like Rio de Janeiro is going to have both, South Africa had the World Cup. Events that cost the governments a lot of money, cost the countries a lot of money, but also bring in a lot of money. And a lot of times the facilities afterwards kind of fall into dilapidation, like in Beijing, in South Africa. Does it end up being a positive influence on the countries? Or
So I would think the answer to that would depend on a case-by-case basis. The thing I would focus on is what has to happen for those facilities to be built. So in the case of South Africa, in the case of Brazil, in the case of China, the issue I work on most was raised in each of those examples. And the issue I work on most is property rights. In each of those cases, poor communities were dispossessed of their land. Their homes were destroyed to make way for new highways, new buildings, new facilities. They were moved to locations that are far out of the cities. They're farther away from jobs. They've been, their connections to vibrant social networks have been severed. So significant harms imposed upon local people for the sake of having the benefit of a World Cup or an Olympics. I think the economics on the benefits of those events is mixed. Some countries may make a little bit of money, but a lot of countries lose money by hosting those events. And certainly people are harmed on the ground as a result of them, or in those three examples. Yes, sir.
The Free Trade Organization claims that they're helping these African countries. What would you say their impact has been in Africa? Has it been a positive one or a negative one?
Free trade overall, has it been positive?
It's like the whole free trade idea that, or fair trade, I would say,
Those are
where
two different things.
Yeah, I mean, fair trade. that's
Fair
what I
trade.
meant,
Yeah, we actually had an interesting bit of a conversation about this at dinner. Here's my take on fair trade. Fair trade is a voluntary process, right? It's no one forces anybody to be in a fair trade organization. Nobody forces anybody to buy fair trade coffee, for example. However, and so if I'm going to use exactly the same example from dinner. If I'm a consumer and I want to go out and spend $15 for a pound of fair trade Rwandan coffee, that's my business, right? I'm spending my dollars as I choose, as I see fit. I may not realize, some consumers don't, that 14 of those dollars are not going to the farmer on the ground in Rwanda. One of those dollars is probably going to that farmer. But, you know, so I'm rationally ignorant, and it's like my bad on that. For the farmers on the ground in Africa, having a fair trade agreement when they don't have very high quality products can be useful because it gives them, it tends to smooth out for commodities producers, it tends to smooth out their income stream. So you're always guaranteed to get X amount of money if you sign a fair trade agreement. The minute you become a high quality producer of something, you don't want to be in a fair trade agreement anymore, because you can, if you're a good quality producer, you can almost always charge more than what you would get by having a fair trade agreement in place. And meeting the requirements that fair trade organizations impose, reporting requirements, can really be quite onerous to businesses on the ground in developing countries. And some kinds of businesses can't participate. So for a whole lot of reasons, you know, I'm actually not too worried about fair trade. If people want to participate in it, that's their business. It's not a silver bullet that's going to solve poverty problems on the ground, and a small percentage of what you pay as a consumer for a fair trade product helps the producer of that product. But if that's how you want to spend your money.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that the IMF was giving loans out to countries as long as they met a few conditions. And I hear like one of the big critiques of that is that it imposes like the golden straitjacket on these countries. And is that just like a left-wing kind of argument, or is there actually some validity to that this might be causing problems?
So it definitely does cause some problems. Governments are oftentimes asked to do things like stop subsidizing the price of petrol or stop subsidizing the price of rice. And that does have an impact on especially poor consumers on the ground. If I am spending a significant portion of my income on food, and the government has been subsidizing the cost of food, if that subsidy goes away, which distorts markets, then I'm going to be paying more for food, and I'm going to be made worse off, and there are going to be food riots, and there have been food riots. So a lot of the problems with IMF conditionality related to changes to economic policies that led to harms that were imposed on the poor disproportionately. But some of the macroeconomic changes that were required, such as trying to rein in activities that led to inflation, would have a counterbalancing impact, right? It would mean that the poor consumer would actually have more money in her pocket because the inflation rates had come down. My sense overall is that the IMF, you know, I don't mean to be saying great organization, but some of the changes that were pushed as a result of its work and other work from other organizations led to there being a value in being more fiscally responsible and doing things like privatizing some of those businesses that help drive more competition in those economies, and that those competitive forces are also really important. So there are some harms, but there are a lot of goods that came as a result also. Okay, so we are at 5 after, and then 5 minutes longer than I should have gone. So thank you so much, Samantha, for the invitation.
Two quick things before you guys leave.